Welcome to our lecture on Buddhism. Now, Buddhism developed in the 6th century BCE, just like Jainism, and it too rejects the Vedas of Hinduism and its caste system. Buddhism is for everyone, regardless of caste. Enlightenment is an option. It's available for any sort of person, regardless of caste, regardless of gender. So that was a revolutionary idea at the time. And you could imagine that that's going to have a certain appeal if you are in one of these lower castes in India at the time. Similar to Jainism, Siddhartha, who becomes the enlightened one, who becomes the Buddha, leaves a life of luxury and enters into a life of self-denial, of asceticism. But whereas Jainism finds enlightenment in that lifestyle, the Buddha finds enlightenment in the middle path between these two extremes. So he's going to stress the middle way over lavishness and asceticism. Buddhism eventually becomes very popular worldwide. If you look at these religions in the numbers, Buddhism is in the hundreds of millions, whereas Jainism only has a handful of million followers. So let's talk about the founder. His name was Siddhartha Gautama, and he was born around 560 BCE. He was the son of a Kshatriya Raja. Remember, that's the warrior caste. So he was born into affluence, born into wealth. And at his birth, he stands out from others. He had a unique birth for two reasons. His mother dies a week after he's born. And legend has it that he was born out of the side of his mother. Now think about some of the other traditions that we're going to talk about in this course. Christianity, for instance. What makes the birth of Christ particularly unique? Well, Mary, the mother of Jesus, got pregnant without intercourse. And secondly, during the celebration of Christmas, what led people from afar, wise men, kings, shepherds, was a great star in the sky, indicating that the child is special. Well, the same goes for the Buddha being born out of the side of his mother. This is someone who's going to be special. When he was born, a soothsayer predicted that Siddhartha's life was going to end up down one of two paths. He was either going to be destined to be a great king or destined to be a Buddha, an enlightened one. And not just a king of a particular region, but a king that would unite many of the fractured areas within India. And so Siddhartha's father was particularly keen on that path and said, well, I want to do everything I can to ensure that that's the path that ends up becoming reality. The soothsayer says, if that's the path that is going to unfold, then Siddhartha can never witness four things in particular. He cannot witness the suffering that all life entails, including number one, sickness, number two, decay, old age, number three, death, and number four, if Siddhartha were to become a great king, he should not witness an ascetic monk. So here's a statue of the Buddha. So here are the four things: a dead body, an elderly person, sick person, an ascetic monk. He marries his cousin at 19, which is common for the time, and he has a son named Rahula. Now that name might not sound familiar to you, but the translation is fetter. If you look up the word, actually do this, look up the word fetter in a dictionary. And you're going to see that it translates to ball and chain. He names his son Ball and Chain. Now what's the significance of that? Well, his family and the attachments that come with family were barriers, in his mind, to achieving enlightenment. And so Siddhartha eventually leaves his family and runs away, just like Mahavira does. And it's very difficult. And so his family, since they're a hindrance to that, were almost like a ball and chain. So after 29 years of living a life of affluence, wealth, of luxury, he is depressed and unhappy. And he realizes that there's more for him in this world and in this life. And one by one, he starts to see each of these four things that he was not allowed to see. So his father shelters him and tries to keep him away from seeing all of these things. But it's inevitable. One by one, he's going to come across them, and he does. He has nightmares of the youth that he is surrounded with becoming old and decrepit. When he is 29 years old, he leaves in the middle of the night. He goes to say goodbye to his wife and child, but he can't bear to wake them up because he knows it'll be too difficult. So he peeks in on them, and they are both asleep. His wife is asleep with his child, and he doesn't wake them up to say goodbye, and he leaves the compound. He leaves the palace on horseback, and he goes to live a life alone, cuts his long hair, and he decides that he's going to live a life of self-denial and be a monk. And so he joins a group of 5 monks and lives with them for 6 years and practices this extreme asceticism, this life of self-denial, deprivation, of having nothing, having no possessions, meditating all day, exposing himself to the elements, the extreme heat, the extreme cold, tormenting the flesh. So this was the path of Mahavira. And it is said that he becomes the greatest ascetic of the time. He was, if you will, the Michael Phelps of this lifestyle. And he starved himself so much that he got down to a single grain of rice per day. He would meditate for all hours of the day. And one legend has it that he was so emaciated, he was so starved, that if he were to touch his belly button, it would reach back and hit his backbone. But again, after years of this side of the spectrum, this other extreme, he's still not satisfied. He grew up in luxury, and that left him feeling empty. And then he enters into a life of asceticism, of self-denial, and still he feels empty. So here he is, a young man in his 30s, and he's a failure twice over. He failed at wealth. He fails at deprivation. And so he's lost again. He's in the same place, even though he has championed these methods with these other monks. And then something happens. There's different versions of the story, but in one of them, he falls into a cold river and then has this moment of awakening where he remembers he has a nostalgic moment of his family and his loved ones, and he is extremely sad and misses them. And when he comes out of the river, he's cold, freezing, and there is a young village girl who sees him and brings him a blanket and brings him a bowl of rice porridge or rice pudding. And this girl's name is Sujata. And in that moment, he has another memory that makes him very nostalgic, because the rice porridge that this young girl is serving to him is the same dish that his stepmother, so remember his biological mother passed when he was just a week old. So he's raised by his stepmother, and it's the same rice porridge that she would give to him as a child. And so he has this moment, this blissful memory of eating this rice porridge. So it's from the kindness of a young girl that there's a great change in Siddhartha's heart. So he realizes that this life of self-denial isn't working. So he gorges on this rice porridge after, weeks, months of starving himself. So the 5 monks that were his brothers, they see him and they laugh and they say Siddhartha likes luxury. They call him a traitor. So from that moment, he leaves the 5 monks and he goes to, I'll come back to this slide. He goes to a tree that might have looked like this, a Bodhi tree, which is a fig tree, Bodhi. And he sits under this tree and he says, I will not move from this spot until I become enlightened. And so here he has a battle with desire. He has a battle with himself. So in this depiction, you see Siddhartha in the lotus position, cross-legged. He's got the bowl of rice porridge in one hand, and he's touching the earth with the other. And surrounding him are demons. So this is the army of Mara. Mara is the god of desire. So all of the temptations in the world, whether it be for food or for sex or for anything that gives us instant gratification. So the demons could be incarnations of the temptation we have for all our gadgets and devices, for junk food, for being lazy when we should be exercising, for taking the easy path instead of the hard path. And so the women in the bottom of this image, they represent sexual desire. That's when Siddhartha realizes that desire is the root of the problem. The problem is suffering. That's going to be one of his great realizations, we'll see. And the cause of this is desire. And so that's a battle with desire. So He's battling with Mara, but it's really a battle with himself. The word for desire in Sanskrit is tanha, Tanha. And that's the problem here. So Mara says to Siddhartha, who do you think you are? I have an army on my side. What do you have? You're just a single human being. Who is on your side? I've got an army. And Siddhartha touches the ground and says, the earth is my witness. The earth is on my side. And if you think about the earth for a moment, that's something that has always been around and has persevered through eons of change and torment. Think of all the ways that the earth has been impacted by human beings and animals. This is particularly relevant today with climate change. So there's a worry that if we don't change our behavior, that climate change will lead to our demise, will destroy the earth, people say. But if you reflect on this, you might realize that the earth will be just fine. We might destroy ourselves as a species, but eventually, with enough time, the earth will recuperate and go on living. So the earth can handle a lot, and it has for billions of years, no exaggeration. So as a point of stability, that's why Siddhartha touches the earth. And that is the moment that he defeats Mara, he defeats desire, and he achieves an inner peace. He achieves enlightenment. He achieves nirvana. So this is an image of a very sacred tree in India. And it's believed that this tree descends from the Bodhi tree. Sometimes it's called the Bo tree. The Bo tree that Siddhartha sat under and became the Buddha. Nirvana literally means put out the flame or extinguish. So the key message in Buddhism is to conquer desire. Not to get rid of desire entirely, but to be smart about our desires. We still need desire for many things, including enlightenment, desire for kindness, a desire to love each other, to participate in humanity. But the desires that get us into trouble, those are the ones that we are extinguishing. The desires for things that give us not sustaining happiness, but instant gratification. And so if we can achieve that, then we will be released from the cycle and achieve moksha or nirvana. It is a state of passions when the limited interests of the common life have been extinguished and the person leaves a life of perfect peace and equanimity. So equanimity means balance. The realizations of the Buddha are captured in 4 truths that are called the Noble Truths, the 4 Noble Truths. And the first one is a recognition of a universal problem that affects everyone, and that is suffering. Suffering is ubiquitous to every human being, to every person. The second truth is that there is a root cause of suffering, and that is desire or attachment. The third realization is that there is a way to end suffering. So number 1 and number 2 were for the most part known by most people. But it's number 3 and number 4 that really make Buddhism stand out. There's a solution to this problem. And it's going to be in the middle way, the middle path, which is called the Eightfold Path. a life of moderation. So Siddhartha's life represents each of the two extremes and his coming to a middle ground. Extravagance, overindulgence is not the way to go. Neither is extreme self-denial or asceticism or minimalism. You have to live your life in the middle. And there's a metaphor with an instrument that captures this quite well. So the middle path, it's neither self-indulgence, which is the harbinger of pain, nor self-mortification, which is itself pain. Success lies in a middle course. True spiritual life is compared to a lute, which emits melodious sounds only when its strings are stretched neither too loose nor too tight. So stretching the strings too loose, that's like the life of indulgence. Too tight, that is the life of deprivation. And you're not going to get music that way. They need to be tuned just right. So our challenge as human beings will be to find that middle way. And here are 8 specific ways we can do that, the Eightfold Path. You have to have balance, equanimity in each of these 8 ways. Your view on life, what you intend to do, what you say, your speech, your behavior, your action, your livelihood, what you choose and how you choose to live, what you choose to do in life, your effort, which is related to intention, your mindfulness, related to view, but mindfulness is more about an introspective perspective, and then concentration. So really, half of these have to do with the mental, and half have to do with behavior, if you count speech as behavior. So view, intention, mindfulness, and concentration all have to do with the mental, where speech, action, livelihood, and effort all have to do with behavior and action, if you count speech as an action. So that's one helpful way to remember the Eightfold Path, is that essentially half of them have to do with balance and equanimity when it comes to the mind, and half have to do with balance, moderation, equanimity when it comes to behavior, including speech. What did the Buddha do after he sat underneath that tree? Well, he went on to teach others what he had learned. And those 5 monks who had spurned him at Benares, they end up becoming the first of many followers. And this group of followers becomes known as the Sangha. And it wasn't just comprised of men, it was comprised of women too. And some of the first women that became adherents of the Buddha were the Buddha's former wife and stepmother. Remember, his biological mother passes a week after his birth, and his former wife. This is revolutionary because you've got a tradition thousands of years old that is open to anyone, to people of all different backgrounds, socioeconomic status, castes, genders. And so it has a wide appeal. And so the following grew and grew. And then eventually, scholars say around 80, because of essentially food poisoning, the Buddha passes. His final words, subject to decay are all component things. Strive earnestly to work out your own salvation. And the second part of those words, I think, are particularly meaningful, pointing out that enlightenment is within you. You don't need all of the things that others will purport to be necessary for happiness, enlightenment, making it in life. We're going to talk about a very important concept now in Buddhism called An-atman. You might notice that the word Atman, which we studied in Hinduism, is contained within the word An-atman. So if Atman is self, true self, then An-atman is no self or not self. So there is some maya, some illusion going on with the self, and we are going to extend that concept to objects that we perceive in general. So the lines that we carve up between the table in front of us and the space around it, or the lines that we draw in the constellations, those are inventions of the mind. We'll talk about that. And desire will be relevant to this discussion. So I want to turn to some words from Hinayana. And this first segment here is really about the metaphor of the stream and the flame. Streams, or rivers, and flames are constantly changing. They're constantly in flux, although they appear to be a cohesive unit. The flame. Look at that flame over time, that singular flame. But really, it's a constant movement of water or of combustion of oxygen. So the illusion is that there is enduring existence over time. But the reality is that there's not. So at the end of this, there is a succession of similar things or happenings. The notion of fixity, which we have of them, is wholly fictitious. So fixity is non-change, and fictitious is false. Fiction isn't real. So now the natural question that arises is, what are we to say about reincarnation, about samsara? What are we to say about moral responsibility? Because if what it means to be a person is not something that endures over time, if the change is the reality, then what is going through the cycle? What is reborn? If we admit that it's not the same, then doesn't the concept of reincarnation collapse in on itself? And what about moral responsibility? How can we hold a person morally responsible for the actions of quote-unquote them from the past? The person from the past, quote-unquote, is a numerically distinct person. This would entail holding somebody responsible for the behavior, action, crime, or good deeds of someone else, which makes no sense. It would be like putting a brother in jail for the crimes of the other brother. That's not fair. So the line in this passage is going to help us out. The third sentence. What one does, it is true, the same does not reap. But he that reaps the fruit is not quite alien either, and so far merits to come in for the good or evil that belonged to the preceding members of that particular series. So instead of thinking of a person as a singular being that persists over time, think of a life as a series of numerically distinct persons. So just like a flame or a stream or a river, in the next moment you have something different. You have new water. You have new oxygen being ignited. Technically, this means that the speaker, me, is a different person by the end of the sentence when we compare that person to the beginning. So gotta be careful with the language. I'll just say you, even though we would have to change the language. You wake up a different person than from the person who went to bed. Or if you're married, the person that you wake up next to is a different person that you went to sleep next to. The person that we throw in jail for some heinous crime is a different person than the one who committed it, necessarily. But again, what about samsara? What about moral responsibility? Well, consider an example to explain this. Suppose we have identical twins. And I want you to imagine identical twins over time, over the span of some interval, or even over the span of their lives. And I want you to think about the notion of similarity. Let's name these twins. Let's name one John and one Chris. And actually am very good friends with a pair of twins, one who's named John and one who's named Chris. John and Chris are very similar in one sense, but they're very different in another sense. So I'm going to introduce two new terms that you probably haven't heard before. One of them is called numeric similarity, and one is qualitative similarity. So here's the difference. Chris and John, they're identical twins. So they are qualitatively very similar. They look the same. But they're still different people. So in another sense, they're not the same. So while they are qualitatively extremely similar, they are numerically distinct. They are numerically dissimilar. Or we could go further to say they are numerically not identical. Chris is numerically identical to Chris, but numerically distinct from John. And the same goes for John. Now, the traditional view has it that Chris and John, as their lives progress, are numerically similar, even numerically identical to their former selves, respectively. So, John today is numerically identical to John tomorrow. Chris today is numerically identical to Chris tomorrow. But that's the view that this concept of an-atman challenges. Is over time, numerical identity or numerical similarity goes out the window. But, as this statement says in this passage, he that reaps the fruit is not quite alien either. And going before that, what one does, it's true, the same does not reap. So what John does, it is true that John won't reap, right? So if John does something, we have to say that the consequences of that will not impact John. However, the person they impact is not so different, not so alien. So as time progresses, there is change. Every moment that goes by, there's some sort of change. We gain weight, we lose weight, we become taller, we become shorter in old age. We might lose a limb. We develop wrinkles. The color of our hair changes. It goes gray, or we dye it. Our fingernails grow, and then we trim them. We change in all these ways, right? Maybe you used to have an appendix, and now you don't. You used to have tonsils, and now you don't. We change in so many ways, and each moment our cells are regenerating. Our food is being digested. We put things in, things come out. There's all this change. And so technically, there's nothing that stays the same. But in the next moment, the discrepancy between myself this second and that person in the next second, they're very, very similar. So qualitative similarity comes in degrees. And there is an extreme degree, a near 100% degree of similarity from Ryan in this moment and Ryan in this moment. And we will say that similarity is qualitative, not numeric, not numerical identity or similarity, but qualitative. So we will say that just as Chris and John are numerically distinct from each other at any given moment, they are also numerically not identical or similar. They are not numerically the same over time, even with respect to, quote, one another. Now let's apply this to an example to make this clear. I want you to imagine that in 2020, John commits a crime. He's prosecuted and is convicted of murder, let's say, in 2020. And then, so let's say the murder happens in 2020. And then the conviction comes a year later in 2021. So what if the defense said, look, we're all Buddhists here, let's say. We know that my client, John Current, in 2021, is innocent of this crime because it wasn't committed by John 2021. It was committed by John 2020. So my client is innocent. But the judge or the jury might be able to say, look, you're right, we admit that we are convicting a different person for the crimes of someone else. However, this person that we are convicting is damn similar to the person who committed the crime. And in fact, no one in the world is as similar. Not even John's twin brother. So that's what's going on here. So while it's true that what one does, right? John 2020 committed murder. It is true that John 2021 will not be convicted. However, John 2021 is going to reap the consequences of his former self, quote unquote, because he is not that different, not quite alien either. And so we could talk about this in terms of qualitative similarity. The degree of qualitative similarity between John and 2021, on the stand, in the courtroom, is much higher to John 2020, the murderer, than it even is to his twin brother in 2020 or 2021. So that's how we deal with moral responsibility, and that's how we deal with samsara. And we could apply this to all objects. Their permanent nature, or their purported permanent nature, we should say, is an illusion. If all things in the world are transient and unsubstantial, they don't have a permanent substance, they're unsubstantial, then our endeavors, our desire for them is really nonsensical. We spend a lot of our time worrying about objects and desiring things. And lately it's a tech gadget craze. And we concern ourselves so deeply with getting them, with possessing them. But when you realize that these objects aren't even real because they're rivers, they're flames, they're constantly changing, so the desire doesn't make sense anymore. You're desiring something that isn't real. And then that helps you to let go of that desire. So if you recognize the impermanence of all objects, then their grip on your desiring of their allure, it starts to fade. And so this can help us in our path to enlightenment. Okay, so that's the Buddhist concept, very philosophical, metaphysical concept of an-atman. So let's move on. Let's talk about the different divisions within Buddhism. And there are two major ones that I want you to know about. There is a conservative group called Hinayana, and there is a more liberal sect called Mahayana. And if you look at the translations, they come out to something like the defective vehicle and the great vehicle. Well, it turns out that the Mahayana Buddhists are the ones that came up with these names, which makes sense. We're going to call ourselves the great vehicle, and all you other people, you're the defective ones. But it's really about the expansion of each of these sects. So why the Great Vehicle? Because if you look at the spread of Mahayana Buddhism, it goes from India into all these parts of China, Korea, Japan, and parts of Southeast Asia, whereas the conservative sect of Hinayana really is only seen in Southeast Asia and Sri Lanka. So the major branch of the defective vehicle is Theravada. And so that's the yellow here in this image. Remember, Siddhartha was born in India. You think of Japan and China, maybe you associate those countries more with Buddhism, but it starts in northern India. And it was because of that widespread appeal of the message of the Buddha. It's for everyone, regardless of caste, regardless of gender. So that explains the spread of it. Here is a branch of Buddhism that we see in Japan called Zen. You probably have heard of Zen Buddhism. In China, it's called Chan Buddhism, and that's because of the different languages. So in Japan, the Japanese term is Zen is a Japanese term, and in China the term would be Chan. But these are meditative, or they're also known as intuitive sects. And so what I would like you to know is that just a small aspect of these traditions. So in intuitive Buddhism, whether it be Zen or Chan, there are these puzzles that are called koans. And you reflect upon them, and the point is to achieve an enlightenment that almost comes like a flash. So one of my favorite Zen koans is the following. If I give you nothing, what should you do with it? If I give you nothing, what should you do with it? So there's not supposed to be an answer, and even trying to solve them and trying to arrive at a final answer, that's really beside the point. The point is to let the irrationality or the irrationality or non-rationality consume you, saturate and soak your being, and to take your mind to a different place, to get away from the everyday, and to realize the illusion, to realize things like An-atman. So koans, that's the puzzle. And the name of the flash of enlightenment is Satori in Zen Buddhism. A few other koans include, one of the ones that gets kind of westernized is this one about the tree falling that I'm sure you've heard. If a tree falls in the forest and there's no one around, does it make a sound? So you're kind of torn in these different directions. You want to say, well, yeah, when things fall, they make sounds, but if there's no one around to hear a sound, is there a sound? So you kind of torn in different directions. What did you look like before you were born? Again, you're torn in these different directions. Well, if I exist, I have a look, but did I have a look before I was born? It seems like no, but then on the other hand, you kind of want to say yes. So there are all these puzzles. Let me show you some comics. I'll go back in a second that I think are kind of funny takes on Zen Buddhism. So I can't decide on a ringtone. It's between the tree falling in the forest and what is the sound of one hand clapping. So clapping makes a sound, but what is the sound? It sounds like clapping, but if there's one hand, then there's no clapping, there's no sound. So you get these kind of tensions and contradictions. And then the Zen crossword puzzle. Clue number 1 across, nothing. 1 across, nothing. What about 1 down? Nothing. So do we fill this in or do we not? Is the puzzle completed or Do we need to think about it? Will it never be completed? Torn in these different directions. So there's a story that I really like about the spread of Buddhism into China. So there was this emperor, this ruler in China, and there was this famous Buddhist whose name was becoming known in parts of China, and this emperor wanted to learn more about Buddhism, and so the emperor invites this famous Buddhist named Bodhidharma to visit the kingdom and, essentially sell him on Buddhism. I'm fascinated by this tradition. I've heard a lot about it, and people are talking about it. Let's hear more. Come visit me and tell me what it's all about. And so that's exactly what Bodhidharma does, and does such a good job of explaining the teachings of the Buddha to this emperor, that the emperor makes it the official religion of the land, essentially. I mean, it's really supposed to represent one of the ways that Buddhism spread into China. But that's not where the story ends. So that's pretty interesting. But the twist on the story, if you will, is really what happens after. So instead of going back home, Bodhidharma decides to just sit and meditate, and finds this cave and enters the cave and sits in a meditative position and says to himself, look, I'm not going to move. I'm going to be like Siddhartha. I'm not going to move from this spot until I achieve the ultimate level of enlightenment. And so that's what he sets out to do. And if you've ever tried to meditate, or if you've ever tried yoga, you know that it's not easy. It sounds easy just to sit still, but after a certain amount of time, your physicality, your physical constitution, your body is going to fight back in terms of pain in your muscles. Or what happened to Bodhidharma is he started getting tired, and he kept falling asleep, and this was annoying him, right? I don't want to fall asleep. I want to stay in this meditative state. And so he figures out a clever way to stay awake. He cuts his eyelids off. So imagine you're having a conversation with your eyelids. You think you're gonna win, and I'm gonna fall asleep by you closing. Aha! Well, I'll cut you off. Now try to close. Now eyes, try to close now. And so that was his solution to the problem. And the legend has it that these eyelids fall to the ground, and then tea leaves sprout up. And so that is how China got tea, according to this legend. Now, if you ask other people, they'll say, "Oh, we already had the tea. This is baloney." But that's one story of how China got tea, is from this Buddhist monk who went to a Chinese emperor and got China to go Buddhist in this region, and then went to this cave and went to meditate. All right, so we're almost done with our lecture here. I want to say a little bit about Tibetan Buddhism, because you probably have heard of the Dalai Lama, a very famous, probably the most famous Buddhist, at least according to Westerners. And he is a proponent, a follower of a certain kind of Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, which originated in Tibet. But there is all this political controversy that I'm going to tell you about. So there are these monks that were special, this Tibetan clergy, that are called the lamas. And if you look at the history, the king at the time, many years ago, hundreds of years ago, is kind enough to give these Buddhists land for their monasteries. So in a very gracious gesture, donates this land to these people so they can build their monasteries and do their thing. But as time goes on, what happens is that these Tibetan lamas become more popular, and this region gains power in followers, but also some political power. And so eventually there is a dramatic change. Whereas in the past, the Chinese government had the power, and the Tibetan clergymen had no power and no land. And then over the centuries, this changes. So where the Chinese government is losing some of its power and lands, and these monks in Tibet, they have a lot of political capital. So eventually, what happens? It comes to a head in 1950, and the Chinese government invades Tibet, and they, according to them, they're reclaiming something that was already theirs, and there's this disagreement. And as a result, the lamas are forced to flee their home, and that's exactly what they do. So they leave Tibet, and the young person that was kind of that fought the Chinese government before the fleeing was this young revolutionary, and that man is this person, the current Dalai Lama. So when he was much younger, he was right there in the mix. So if you've ever seen those, a T-shirt or a poster or bumper sticker that says "Free Tibet," that's what this is all about. It's about this political turmoil and upheaval in the 1950s, and the Dalai Lama being the leader for this group, the Tibetan Buddhists. And what is amazing is that even to this day, the Dalai Lama has not been able to return home to Tibet because of the aftermath of this political turmoil. And even though he's a Tibetan Buddhist, he hasn't been in Tibet in decades, and lives in northern India and travels all over the world. He's come to the United States, come to California many times, and given talks. So here's the Dalai Lama with President Obama and former Governor Schwarzenegger. Yeah, so now you know about the Dalai Lama, who showed up in the documentary, the Buddhist documentary. Last thing I want to talk about is the prominent symbol of Buddhism, which to many is called the Dharma Chakra, and it has 8 points, and of course that represents the Noble Eightfold Path of right speech and action, livelihood, efforts, intention, mindfulness, concentration, and then the wheel itself represents samsara, the cycle of birth, life, death, and rebirth. So those points break free of the cycle, and that's because that is the way to do it, through the the Noble Eightfold Path. So that's it. That's our discussion of Buddhism. So I hope that was clear, and yeah, thanks for listening.